Welcome back to Shapes of Grief, everybody. Liz Gleeson here. I'm really happy to be back with you. It's been several months since I released a podcast episode. Thank you for bearing with me. I see the numbers on the podcast are going up nevertheless, which means that you're listening back to previous episodes. So thank you for sticking around. Some of you will know, if you follow me on social media, that my lovely dad died back in March, on the 6th of March. And I spent 3 weeks living with him before then. So that was a really wonderful and profound experience to have had. But the podcast has taken a hit because my attention went in other directions after that. So I guess I just really wanted to touch base today. I don't have a guest, but I did want to tell you about one of the projects I've been working on, which has been taking my attention since Dad died. And that's an online grief education program that I've put together. It's primarily aimed at healthcare professionals, specifically counsellors and psychotherapists. But really, it could be of interest to anybody who's grieving and who wants to learn more about grief, because I think one of the elements of, moving through our grief is really learning about grief, psychoeducation, learning about why we feel a certain way, what's going on in our body, what's going on intellectually, what are the different tasks of grief, if you like, that we often need to work through. So, so it could be of interest to any of you who are experiencing grief at this time. And as always, it's about so much more than grief. It's about really the human condition, why we love, how we love, what happens when the person we love is lost, other types of losses, ways in which we can experience grief, types of grief. It's a vast subject. And so many people really, really don't understand. So to gain a little bit of education and understanding in the field of grief and loss, I think is just so empowering. I came up with this idea, it must have been about 6 years ago, when I was in the Irish Hospice Foundation doing my master's in bereavement studies. And I remember one of the first lectures, it was probably with Dr. Helen Greeley, who was giving us a lecture on theories and models of grief. And I remember just thinking, everybody needs to know this, not just the 20 of us that are sitting here today. This is life important stuff, and everybody should know this. And I think on that day, a little seed was planted. But I suppose not everybody has the time or the finances to do a 2-year master's or even a year diploma. So what I have done is I've synthesized all of my learning, or a lot of my learning, into one place. I've also made it really, really affordable, because I really believe that people need to access grief education. In my clinical practice, I find that people come and they've already been to several counsellors, and they're discovering that counsellors, certain therapists just don't understand grief. So it's so important that if we're working with bereavement, with grief, with loss, that we understand the area. I only work with grief and loss, and I understand it to a large degree. There's lots of other areas in counselling and psychotherapy that I just don't understand as fully, so I don't work in those areas. But I suppose my message is, if you are going to see people who've had a bereavement or who are grieving, please make sure you understand the subject and educate yourself if you're a counsellor or a psychotherapist. The NICE guidelines in the UK, I never remember, it's either 2009 or 2012, say that we should be doing around 30 hours of bereavement education or grief education in our undergraduate degrees. And then if we're working with grief and loss, we should be doing 12 CPD hours every single year. And, I can't speak for many people, but I know in Ireland, we really don't come close to that because there isn't a lot of education available. The Irish Hospice Foundation would be one of the only places in Ireland offering online, ongoing courses and workshops in grief education. So they're worth looking up also on hospicefoundation.ie. I teach for them also. Okay, so what I thought I would do is just bring you through the course. If you're listening, I will try and be as clear as possible. If you're watching, you'll see my screen. Let me just share it here now. Okay, so I'm just taking you into the Shapes of Grief website, which is shapesofgrief.com. And you'll come across Dr. Irvin Yalom. Many of you, particularly counsellors and psychotherapists, will know who Yalom is. He's the god of all psychotherapists, I think. And he's written a lovely book on A Matter of Death and Life. He wrote it with his wife, Marilyn. 2 years ago, Marilyn was diagnosed with incurable cancer. And the book is their journey through that anticipatory grief, Marilyn getting ready for her death, and Irv dealing with the anticipation of that, the denial of that, and then following Marilyn's death, the grief of it. It's a beautiful read, and it's a really gorgeous conversation to have with Dr. Irvin Yalom about that book and about his experience, and importantly about how his awareness of grief has changed profoundly since his wife died. So here's an example of an incredibly talented, gifted psychotherapist who has worked for decades, who has produced loads of books, like really wonderful books on all sorts of different subjects. Many of us have read his books, and yet until he experienced that profound loss of a very close attachment figure, he really hadn't experienced the depths of loss. And he acknowledges that. So another reason why I've put together this grief education program, sometimes we think we know, sometimes our perceived competencies in a subject are much more than our actual competencies. You know, I'm guilty of that. I'm sure many of us are. And if for no other reason but for you to realize, gosh, I really thought I understood grief. I thought I worked well with it. And to realize, you know, I really could be upping my skill set a little bit here or doing things differently, then the program will have been a success. So the program is set out in 4 different modules. The first module is Theories and Models of Grief, with a few bonus discussions. So I give a lecture here. It's about an hour and a half long. I take you through all the different theories and models of grief, from Freud to, you know, when he wrote his paper, I think he wrote it in 1914 and published it in 1916, 1917, Mourning and Melancholia. And so I take you right from Freud's Mourning and Melancholia up to more modern theories such as narrative therapy, meaning making, continuing bonds, covering attachment theory, the dual process model, stages and phases models and why they didn't work, and tasks of mourning. So I think it's interesting. It's interesting to see as well where the stages of grief came from, and that they were never meant to be applied to grief as a model or a theory. And unfortunately, it's still the main theory that circulates today. So I'm hoping that this lecture will dispel a few myths and give people other theories to look up and work with. I met with Dr. George Bonanno, he's probably done the most research globally in the field of grief and loss. He's done great studies, longitudinal studies with large samples of people of the population. And he's given us some really, really important facts. One of them, for example, that 60% of people will not need extra professional grief support, 60% of people who are bereaved. About 30% of people will need a little bit extra grief support, maybe from professionals or from community groups or volunteer groups. And then about 10% of people will need specialist intervention for prolonged grief. So really interesting chat with Dr. George Bonanno. And we look at flexibility and resilience in grief and choice in grief. Do we have a choice in how we grieve? Do we have a choice in how we're going to be? So that's an interesting discussion. I also talked with the grandfather of grief, Professor Colin Murray Parks. Dr. Parks is in his 90s now, living in the UK. He has worked with grief for decades. He worked with John Bowlby on attachment theory. He worked on, the first community disasters such as Aberfan, 9/11, the tsunami in Southeast Asia. So really interesting discussion with Dr. Colin Murray Parks. Dr. Robert Niemeyer, who's been a guest on the podcast, talks about narrative therapy, so the importance of speaking our loss, speaking our grief, and also the importance of making meaning. The minute we lose someone, we search for meaning, like why is this happening? What meaning is there in my loss? What meaning is there in my grief? So he gives some really beautiful clinical examples throughout our discussion as well. Professor Margaret Strobe of Strobe and Schutt, the dual process model, kindly lent me this video, or gave me this video, which she recorded with Dr. Lucy Selman for the Good Grief Festival. And Lucy and Professor Strebe kindly let me use it because Professor Strebe was just too busy to come onto this program. So I'm really grateful to both Professor Strebe and Dr. Lucy Selman of the Good Grief Festival. And they take us through the dual process model and lots of other really good information on grief and what the research shows us. Dr. John Mills, as I said to John, he's all the P's. He's a psychoanalyst, a psychotherapist, a philosopher, and we have a lovely discussion about Freud's mourning and melancholia, the difference between mourning and melancholia, the difference between depression and grief. So it was a real honor to meet with Dr. Mills as well. And then lastly, in Module 1, I met with Professor Dennis Klaas, who is responsible for the continuing bonds theory, along with Nickman and Silverman. And we have a discussion about continuing bonds and where it came from and why it's important. So great learning in all of these discussions. I really hope you'll consider subscribing and listening. That's just Module 1. Module 2 then, you'll maybe recognize this face, Dr. Susan Delaney. Susan was my supervisor when I was learning prolonged grief disorder and complicated grief therapy. She works alongside Kathy Shear from the Centre for Complicated Grief. They've done lots of trainings together, which I've attended. And Susan talks about prolonged grief disorder, what it is, versus normal grief. I say that in inverted commas. And then we look at complicated grief therapy. Even more exciting is two fabulous people, Fiona and James, both who went through complicated grief therapy, so a 16-week protocol to address their prolonged grief disorder, which had been lingering in their lives for over a decade. And they talk about how complicated grief therapy changed things for them, how it turned their lives around, literally. And their stories are both really, really inspiring. And they're just so happy with their new lease of life, this new start, that they were really keen to let people know about prolonged grief disorder, that it's a thing that affects about 10% of bereaved people. And they really wanted to share their story of hope with others. Next, we have a lecture on anticipatory grief, and that's with Katrina Tay and Wendeline McNichol. Both counsellors, supervisors, and end-of-life doulas, and really, really great lecture about anticipatory grief when we're anticipating the death of someone. And it can last for weeks, it can last sometimes for years or decades. Sometimes it can begin the moment somebody gets a difficult diagnosis. So a really great lecture with the two of them, who are good friends of mine. Have become good friends of mine from meeting through Shapes of Grief. And then we have a lovely discussion where myself, Wendeline and Katrina talk about anticipatory grief and how we've recognized it in our own lives. I'm talking about it in relation to my father, who had dementia and who was, ill on and off, and obviously has now since died. Two other discussions here that are like, I just get so excited when I see their faces. Dr. Pauline Boss is one of my favorite people on the planet. A wonderful, wonderful academic and clinician. She's a family psychologist and a family therapist. She coined the term ambiguous loss. And I remember first hearing this on the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett. And ambiguous loss is when there's a loss, but it's not necessarily seen, or it's ambiguous. For example, if somebody's body is not recovered and they're presumed dead, but we're not sure, and we have to develop this narrative of and or both, what's true. They are probably dead, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're having a great life on an island somewhere with amnesia. And learning to make space for these and both statements, if you like. Another example of ambiguous loss is dementia, like I just mentioned, where somebody is physically present or psychologically absent. Or the case where we have a parent or a family member who's physically present, but psychologically or emotionally absent. That happens many of us. And we can go through our lives feeling this grief and not really knowing what it is, or is it even grief, because it's ambiguous. So fabulous discussion with Dr. Pauline Boss. So much to learn. Like, I've listened to it several times over. Another name that many of you might be familiar with is Dr. Kenneth Doka. And Dr. Doka coined the term disenfranchised grief. And he first came across this working with bereaved people, and somebody talked about the grief of losing their spouse. And somewhere in the room, somebody put up their hand and said, "You think that's bad? What about your ex-spouse, where nobody acknowledges that it's a loss?" And that's where they first sort of realized that disenfranchised grief was a thing, where the loss isn't acknowledged, and therefore the grief isn't acknowledged. So this would have been really common amongst gay couples, certainly prior to the 2000s, where relationships weren't being acknowledged, and therefore the grief wasn't acknowledged. So disenfranchised grief was massive in the LGBT community. And there's other types of disenfranchised grief also, such as perinatal loss, for example, miscarriage, or termination for medical reasons, where there's a fatal fetal abnormality. Sometimes if a baby is stillborn, very disenfranchised for many people, certainly very disenfranchised for fathers. Often their grief around perinatal loss is not recognized enough. And an interesting point that Dr. Doka makes is, at some stage, all grief becomes disenfranchised. I thought, wow, I'd never really thought about that, but it's so true, because at some stage, everybody moves on, except for the griever. And there comes a point where their grief they feel maybe, and this, I'm generalizing here, it's not true in all cases, but there comes a stage where people move on, stop, naming the deceased or talking about them, and we're expected to be over our grief. And we know at this point, listeners to the podcast know that that's not what happens. So some really interesting points made here with Dr. Kenneth Doka. We talk about disenfranchised grief, and we also talk about gender and grief and different grieving styles. So that is module 2. Module 3 then is perspectives of grief and types of loss. So in this module, we look at all sorts of different perspectives of grief. I have Dr. Michelle Harris, who talks about Black grief. She talks about the importance of understanding history, systemic racism, understanding why a Black person, particularly in America, would grieve differently to a white person. And we have a duty of care. We have a duty not to be colorblind, those of us who are white practitioners. And Michelle makes some really, really important and valid points about what we need to consider when we are working with Black people, particularly if we're not Black ourselves. I give a lecture then on LGBT grief, and similarly, what are the different themes that we need to be aware of, particularly if we're not LGBT? What are the themes and topics and facts of history that will influence how an LGBT person grieves? So again, interesting stuff, check it out. Midwife Brenda Casey from one of the maternity hospitals in Dublin and we have a discussion on perinatal loss. It's a very tender discussion. We talk about the needs of parents when they know their baby is going to die. How can we use that laboring time, that anticipatory time? How can we prepare mothers and fathers who are about to welcome their baby and also grieve their baby at the same time? And Brenda talks about the ultimate paradox of death before birth. And I think for people working in the maternity setting or who are going to be working with perinatal loss after the fact in clinical practice, really, really great discussion, lots of learning. And I'm delighted again, there's another testimonial from a client called Maria, who had a difficult time around the birth of her baby, Emily, who died. And Maria shares her story in the hope that people will learn from it and that similar mistakes will be avoided in the future. So big thanks to Maria for her courage and her vulnerability in sharing her experience of giving birth to Emily and, you know, some of the pitfalls for staff members to avoid. And then she talks about how we work together in grief counselling a few years later to bring Emily back into the family essentially and to tap, you know, to get Maria's grief back on track. Jill Mann, another wonderful psychotherapist. Jill wrote the book A Song Inside and features on the Shapes of Grief podcast. Jill is a psychotherapist who works with grief and loss, and she's also a bereaved mother. And a beautiful, beautiful lecture on parental bereavement, some of the themes that we face in clinical practice when we're working with somebody who has lost a child. Mikel then features again in a lecture on children and grief. Really important points. Mikel goes through how children's grief is different to adults' grief, the needs of the grieving child, what we need to look out for, how we can support them, and another, you know, really valuable presentation. Dr. Cale Monk over in Missouri does a lovely lecture on separation and divorce and how it can impact us emotionally and physically, and the needs of people going through separation and divorce, particularly if they're coming to seek your support in clinical practice. Here's another familiar face, Niamh Fitzpatrick, clinical psychologist. Niamh works with grief and loss and all sorts of things, but also is a bereaved sibling. She has lost two sisters. Her baby sister Anna died around the time of birth. And then her adult sister, Dara Fitzpatrick, Captain Dara Fitzpatrick, died suddenly and tragically in a helicopter accident just a few years ago. So another beautiful, vulnerable, heartfelt conversation with Niamh, where we look at, you know, a variety of themes that arise, but how Anna's death, how she dealt with Anna's death all those years ago, how she dealt with Dara's death 40 years later, and then how the two sisters kind of came together in death, and how Anna came back into the family, if you like, in a way that she mightn't have had Dara not died. So it's a really beautiful conversation. Listen in. We talk about the needs of siblings when their sibling dies. We talk about how families change. We talk about secondary and tertiary losses when a sibling dies in a family. And we talk about the grieving therapist. Niamh and I recorded this conversation, I think just 2 or 3 weeks after my father died. And we talk about you know, the grieving clinician and how we manage that with clients. And for Niamh, obviously her loss was so public that all her clients knew that she had lost Dara tragically and suddenly. So we talk around that, and it's another really interesting topic for people to have a listen to. Katrina Gerber, Dr. Katrin Gerber, does a beautiful, it's so moving, a lecture on grief in older people. And the research they did, really, really stunning. They did interviews with older people about their experience of loss. And then they used a certain technique to create poetry out of the interviews, and then had the people read out the poems that came out of their interviews. It would move a stone. Like, it's so beautiful. I sat watching it one morning when Katrin first sent it to me, and I was having my breakfast and there was just tears streaming down my face, just listening to the depth of loss and the depth of love from people. And just, I suppose, I was flooded with compassion and empathy. And the work that Katrin is doing over in Australia, Dr. Katrin Gerber, is absolutely fantastic. So another great lecture to look out for on the Shapes of Grief education program. So just two more parts here in module 3. You might recognize, anybody in Ireland might recognize Fiona Toomey here. Fiona Toomey set up the charity Hug, a Healing Untold Grief group. And Fiona's daughter Millie died a few years ago. Millie was just 11. She died suddenly and tragically by suicide. And Fiona really struggled to find appropriate support. And we talk about not so much Millie's death, but more Fiona's needs after Millie died, and the deficit in support that was available to her, what she needed, where she found it, and some difficult experience that she had with grief, or with therapists who weren't grief informed and who weren't trauma informed. And we talk about the needs of the person who is bereaved suddenly in this way, and as clinicians, what skills we need to brush up on. So another amazing conversation with Fiona Toomey. And then Katrin is another person who gives her story, who shares so generously her story of her husband's death by suicide. Katrin was a mother of a toddler and was just 2 weeks off from giving birth when her husband died by suicide. So Katrin talks about the process of going to grief therapy after her husband's death, and why she chose to go to grief therapy and how it helped her. So that could be of interest to anybody who's listening, who's supporting people who are bereaved by suicide, or indeed anybody who's bereaved by suicide. So if you're still with me, thank you. I'm moving on to module 4 now, the last module of this program. We have a lecture from Megan Reardon Jarvis on traumatic grief and traumatic loss. Really important. In clinical practice, rarely do we see people who are having a normal adaptive response to grief. They're generally not the people who come looking for support. Most people who come looking for support for their grief, it's because there is an element of trauma or shock, or their bereavement has been sudden, or the meaning they have made out of the death or the dying process has created some sort of trauma for them in their system. So really interesting lecture on traumatic grief and traumatic loss. I give several lectures here in this module as well. One of them is on the physiology of grief, so how grief manifests in our bodies. That's a particular area of interest to me. I also lecture on the polyvagal theory in clinical practice. I hope I've made it accessible. It's a game changer for clients to understand the polyvagal theory and to know what's going on the physiological level. A really important part of psychoeducation. Jill Mann gives another lecture here, beautiful lecture on pain and choice in grief. So that moment where people start to identify moments of choice in their grief, pivotal for many people, really important lecture for clinicians to listen to. Dr. Dan and Dr. Dan Gordon and Juliet Rosenfeld discuss death anxiety and death denial. Dr. Dan is a GP. He talks about, you know, speaking with people in his practice who are facing a terminal illness and how much information is enough information. And he also talks about a personal experience where a family member was dying, and I guess the denial in the family, and also, you know, where was his responsibility to share information. I offer a lecture on counselling in bereavement and loss. So a brief overview of counselling in bereavement and loss, or bereavement and loss in clinical practice. Esther Ramsey-Jones, who is a palliative psychotherapist and also an author. She's been on the podcast. She's a fabulous speaker. She talks about supporting a tender death in all settings. So this could be particularly interesting for anybody who is anticipating that they will be accompanying a loved one who is going to die, or anybody working in care homes. This would be a really, really good lecture for you to listen to. Esther's wonderful. I, again, do another lecture here on burnout and self-care. I need to watch that myself again. We just need constant reminders as practitioners on, you know, how to care for ourselves, how to keep everything in balance, and how to mind ourselves throughout this work. So there's a lot on the physicality of burnout, and, you know, how we can also use our bodies then to resource ourselves. Dr. Sheila Boland, clinical psychologist. Many of you will recognize her also from the podcast. Sheila is originally from the UK, but lives in the south of Ireland. And her little boy, Ushin, died a few years ago. So Sheila has put together a fabulous presentation on the needs of the family when a child is terminally ill. This would be particularly good for anybody working in children's palliative care, children's hospice, or in any children's hospital, really, where families might be facing a terminal illness with their child or a diagnosis. And then in another discussion, myself and Sheila discuss the needs of the family when a child is terminally ill and when a child dies in a family. 2 more lectures then from me. Ethical practice in grief counselling. Are we working ethically when we are working with people who are bereaved? And then also, who looks for grief therapy? So if 60% of people are going to have an adaptive normal response to grief, who are the others who maybe have gone slightly off track, or who just need extra support when they're grieving? So that's what I look at in this lecture. And then last but not least is the wonderful Dr. Diana Sands. Many of you may know her. She, I suppose, is the go-to person globally for traumatic death by suicide, supporting people who've experienced a traumatic loss in their family. So Dr. Sands does a lovely presentation here. It's a clinical intervention. So very practical, of how to make a resilience cloak. So working with people in clinical practice who may need to build up their internal resources, and how creating a resilience cloak could actually do this. So that's it in a nutshell. That is the Shapes of Grief education program. I'll just go back up here to the beginning of it. This video is a little introductory video. It's also available on Vimeo, Shapes of Grief Vimeo channel and Shapes of Grief YouTube channel. So I won't play it for you now. Yeah, I have purposely kept this program really, really affordable. It's the price of 2 therapy sessions. It's €199. It is worth a lot more. The course is essentially a diploma in bereavement studies. It's worth a lot more than what I'm offering it for, but it's really important to me that people can access it. There are CPD certs for sale on the course, but that's, you know, you can decide if you want that or not. And that's just your way of being able to support the program. If you're able to, you know, there's been no funding for this. I've funded the whole thing. I've worked on it in my own time. So, you know, if you're a fan of Shapes of Grief and you'd like to support my work, I would be so grateful if you would consider purchasing the education program. Certainly, please do spread the word. Genuinely, there's some really excellent content in here. It's a mini grief education. Well, it's not really that mini. It's quite a comprehensive grief education, and so important if you are working with loss and grief that you are grief educated. We have a moral and ethical responsibility to the people we support. And unfortunately, what happens is somebody goes to a counsellor or a therapist who isn't grief informed, and the client has a substandard session and then leaves and thinks that's it, counselling doesn't work, and they may never go back and they may never get the support they need. So I strongly urge you and encourage you to get yourself grief educated, even if it's not here with me. There's other programs online. The Irish Hospice Foundation do a postgrad diploma in bereavement studies and a master's in bereavement studies. Wherever you get it, just make sure that you get it. And I would love if you would support the Shapes of Grief program. I will be coming back to the podcast now that this is up and launched. So I have some interviews already recorded, which will be coming out over the coming weeks. Some great material, great conversations. And I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all again via the podcast, and also hearing what you think about this grief education program. So stay well, everybody, and I will see you next week.